Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Professor Sides, and this course is Principles of Microeconomics, Chapter 4, The Market Forces of Supply and Demand. In our previous lecture, we spoke about what quantity supply or supply is, and we talked about the law of supply and the relationship between price and quantity as it relates to the supplier. This segment of the lecture, we're going to talk about the behavior of the sellers and those variables which shifts the entire supply curve, either to the left inward or to the right outward. And we will also talk about the difference between a supply curve shift and a supply curve movement. When we talk about supply curve shift or the supply curve shifters, basically what we're talking about are those variables that affect quantity supply at all levels, other things being considered, other things being equal, or we hold everything else constant. As with the demand curve shifters and demand curve movement, the difference is this. When you have demand curve movement, that means you are moving from one point to another point on the curve. Likewise, on supply, when you have supply curve movement, you are moving from one point to another point on the same curve. This is in contrast with a supply curve shift, where the entire curve moves from the left or to the right, which means that we are increasing or decreasing supply at every price level, not just at one. There are a few factors that will cause the supply curve to shift. Now, stepping back a little bit, what causes the supply curve to move? If we find movement along the curve, the only thing that will cause a supply curve movement is a change in price. So if we go from $6 to $5, the point at $6, we will move from that point to the point on the same line to $5. That's supply curve movement. What is the supply curve? Some factors that affect the supply curve shift. The first one would be an input of prices. And in this point, input means what did it take for us to make our product? What are the inputs? What did we put into the product to make a final product? For example, in the country of Lane, we make cakes. And so when we make cakes, the final product is the cake itself. But the input would be the flour, eggs, milk, butter, sugar. Those are the inputs. And so if we change the price of the input, so if the price of flour goes up, that will cause the supply curve to shift. If the cost of eggs go up, that will cause the supply curve to shift. The price of the cake will eventually change, but in the moment, the change is not because we changed the price of the cake, but because we changed the price of the ingredients that went into the cake. So input would be the ingredients that goes into the final product. It is the raw materials. And the relationship with input prices, the change in input prices, is that if the input price increases, quantity supply will decrease. When we look at this effect, basically what we see here is this. And before we get started with the shifting, let me show you movement. If we change price from $4 to $3, then our quantity supplied would go from 20 to 15. This is called movement, supply curve movement, not supply curve shift. Supply curve shift would be the entire supply curve would shift or move, and that is your shift. But if we're going from one point to another point, that is movement. From one point, from the curve, to move the curve from point A to from line A to line B, that is a shift. And so if input prices increase, we would see a shift. In this case, the price of milk falls, and we use milk in lattes in our latte example. So if the price of milk went down, for whatever reason, there was an oversupply of milk, and so the price went from $3.29 a gallon to $2.15 a gallon, then that decrease in the price of milk will cause the supply curve to shift to the right, meaning that suppliers are willing and able to sell more lattes because their input price, which is milk, decreased. The second supply curve shifter would be technology. When there is a change in technology, that will affect or impact the supply curve. A good example of this is, at the risk of telling off on my age, I remember when stores did not have self-checkout registers, where every aisle, every register had a checker, and if the checker wasn't there, then that checkout line was not open. And so at that point, when we moved from having just a cashier at the checkout and to the self-check, that was an increase in technology. So when stores implemented the self-checkout, then they could open up those lanes without having someone to monitor. And so that shift in technology caused more checkouts to be available, meaning the supply for cash registers increased. So technology can cause more output, which would shift your supply curve. So as technology increases, quantity supply increases. So there's a positive relationship. The third shifter is number of sellers. And this is similar to the demand with the number of buyers. As more and more sellers enter the market, then supply increases, the quantity supplied increases, which causes the supply curve to shift outward. And the last variable that causes the supply curve to shift is expectations. If the seller has some type of expectation about the future, that will affect the supply today. For example, if we expect there to be a war to break out in the Middle East, then sellers of oil products, gas products, would decrease their supply now, to hold off on they would have a reserve and decrease their supply so that they would have gas later on to overcome the shortage. Or they may go the opposite and try to sell off everything that they have and then get out of the business. But in any event, what they anticipate will happen in the future changes their behavior or quantity supplied now. Now let's look at a summary. And when we have a change in price, that causes a movement, remember, from one point to another point. That's movement along the curve. When we change input prices, when we change technology, when we change the number of sellers, or when we change expectation, that's going to cause the supply curve to shift. Remember, price is the only variable that when it changes, we have movement. If anything else changes, then the curve will shift. This concludes our supply curve shifters. I look forward to speaking to you on the next lecture.